Welcome everybody who's joining us live here on GoToWebinar. Welcome to everybody who's viewing this presentation later. We're going to have a fun panel today talking about double extortion ransomware, and we'll get into what that is and some more background on what to do about it, how to prevent it, what some of the factors are. We got a panel discussion here planned today, so I'm going to go ahead and just bring our panelists on right away. First panelist is the CEO of Ubiq Security, whose mission is to enable developers to easily and quickly integrate encryption directly into their applications, reducing the messy and complex world of encryption to two API calls and 3 lines of code. Welcome to our panel, Weiss Isa.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversation today.
And we are also going to be joined today by our very own DNSFilter COO. Here at DNSFilter, the mission is to provide innovative technology that challenges the way the industry thinks about security via DNS. Our second panelist, Jen Ayers. Welcome, Jen.
Thanks, Mike, and looking forward to our conversation, and great to see you once again, Weiss.
For sure.
All right, so we're going to get started here. We're talking about double extortion ransomware. So anybody joining, I'm sure we all know about ransomware. The simple form is somebody gets some code on your computer, they encrypt all your files and have the opportunity to ransom for the decryption key. In this case, we're talking about the next level of that, which is they've also had the opportunity to extract files from your network, and they're going to extort you for an additional payment to avoid sharing that data or releasing it out onto the internet, selling it to somebody else. And that's what makes it so tricky here. So we'll jump in. Jen, what are some misconceptions about ransomware and hackers, extortion or otherwise that you'd like to start to help us clear up today?
I think that's a really good question. And I think the misconception really comes around to what is the unknown in this. But when you start to peel back the layers and when you start to really look at who these ransomware actors and ransomware players are, what you fundamentally discover is this is a business. It's a business like any other. Weiss and I were just chatting, in advance, ransomware as a service. I mean, if you take sort of the same models of software as a service and apply that to ransomware as a service, and you have almost a very similar business model, code for sale, premium bundle packages of whether you want, emails included in that bundle, whether you want support for that bundle, whether you just want, specific lines of code. So it's certainly evolved over the past, 7 to 8 years from the standard, script kiddie, blast and spray to a much more lucrative big business model, to take a phrase from CrowdStrike, in terms of big game hunting. So looking more for, more for areas to encrypt that are going to net them the most amount of money, which means typically moving from that I encrypted your personal photos and your, on your local computer to now very big businesses and I encrypted your entire database. Or in the case of double extortion, I've stolen all the data off your database and then I've encrypted it and you can no longer do business transactions.
Yeah, Jen, yeah, I totally agree with some of those points. One of the other thing I think is important to mention is the sort of ransomware economy has grown because, to your comments earlier, a couple of years back, it was sort of an individual or small group of individuals looking for a quick economic opportunity against a certain company, and then sort of the bigger fish in that underground community started to notice that there's a lot of money to be made here, right? And I think some nation states even started to get involved and realize this is a way to bypass sanctions. It's a way for us to sort of fuel our own domestic economies. So I think there's a lot of other areas where people might perceive ransomware attackers as small bands of individuals that are not highly organized, but they have become very highly organized and very well mobilized as well. The other thing that we've seen, I think, over the last few years is sort of an overlap between the traditional advanced persistent threat actor operators and the ransomware operators, and the sharing of tooling and techniques and tradecraft. And I think that makes things more dangerous just because the advanced persistent threat actors, their mission sets are generally sort of different and focused on theft of intellectual property or advancing a specific group over another group through theft of information and other knowledge and tradecraft. But as we see those two worlds sort of begin to not necessarily overlap because their missions are different, but begin to share their technologies, I think the potency of the attacks are definitely becoming much more serious.
Yeah, and harder to detect.
As we get started
Absolutely.
here, I am going to kick off one of our polls just so we can get a sense from the audience why they're joining us today. Then we'll continue the conversation. What concerns you most about the double extortion ransomware? A couple options here: your ability to protect your own corporate IP, your ability to protect employee data or client data, the threat of public exposure, or something else. You can just let us know in the chat. We'll leave that poll open for a minute here while we continue the conversation. You both mentioned how this is becoming an industry of its own. Do we see that any particular industries are on the receiving end of it, or are they pretty much equal opportunity attacks here?
So that's a question that I get asked a lot. And the truth is that there isn't a specific industry, that you can say, oh, this one's always, this one's going to be the one that's at risk. If you look at, standard reporting that's been, standard reports that are available, all the way back to 2016, almost all of them have, a top 10 industry list. And what you will notice, for the most part, that industry, the top 10 industry list hasn't changed. Maybe the bottom ones, who's made it up to the top 10, or maybe there's been some shift within that top 10. But the bottom line is that every industry is ultimately at risk. It's the flavor of the day. Do you have what they want, in terms of intellectual property theft? Are you, a specific area that they may be targeting in, maybe manufacturing the flavor, maybe, as we saw last year, a decrease a little bit in healthcare, but healthcare is back to being popular today. So it's really, there is no safe spot anymore.
Anything to add to that, Wes?
Yeah, absolutely. No, Jen nailed it. I mean, it's also the other thing to consider too is where do they think they can make money? Who do they think is actually going to pay the ransom? And who's going to have a compelling event? Let's highlight Colonial Pipeline. There was a very compelling event to do something because literally millions of people were having trouble getting gasoline. Gas stations up and down the Mid-Atlantic literally were turning people away or shutting down operations because there was no gas. That obviously didn't turn out the way that the attackers expected for a number of reasons around, seizure of cryptocurrencies and et cetera. So they ended up making off with what they thought they could. But I think it's also important to consider when an attacker is going after an organization, just like most vendors in technology have a list of customers they want to target, they're going through the same process. They're prioritizing those lists. Where can we create a compelling event? Who has a compelling event? Just by the nature of their business, and where can we make money? So it's really every industry.
Absolutely. The other key point to kind of pivot off that as well is, I think, in terms of Colonial Pipeline, that became, certainly, I always kind of say like a media frenzy, because it started getting, it had, significant impact, to the economy. It had significant impact to individuals. Whereas, sometimes companies themselves, may have a faster, businesses that may have a faster road to recovery. It's not quite as noticeable. They either pay the ransom or they just restore them back up, and it kind of stays under the wire, right? You don't get as much public visibility into that. But it does lend, to the fact that with the Colonial Pipeline hit, I think there became a lot more awareness in many circles outside of the cybersecurity industry that our critical infrastructure is very much at risk.
That's a really good point, Jen. That's the thing with we've both been in cyber almost our entire careers. And the thing that's always been difficult to sort of articulate or bring to life for a board or a C-level executive, or even when I'm talking to my family, is the realness of the impact. So much happens so much has happened in the digital world, and we can talk about IP theft happening for 10 or 15 years. But when something sort of affects us in the physical realm, I think that's when we're like, oh, okay, no, this is really real. And sort of shutting down gasoline supply is one thing, but what if it was a hospital, which has happened in the past, and lives at risk? So it definitely sort of brings a completely different dimension, and the awareness definitely skyrockets.
Yeah, and hopefully some of that awareness will help drive some change, in terms of how serious companies are taking the ransomware threat. I mean, yes, you may be a financial services organization, but ultimately, what is the impact if your customers can't get to their money? It's beyond just brand reputation of a company. You're now impacting people's livelihood to pay their rent on time, to pay for their groceries and things like that. So it's certainly a ripple effect. It always creates a certain type of a ripple effect. And I hope that people are taking this much more seriously now than they have been in the past.
Seems like they started to get the attention of the federal government too when they started messing with infrastructure like the Colonial Pipeline. We saw recently executive orders from Biden and some of the um, federal departments starting to take this more seriously and pay attention. Let's check in on our poll. Overwhelmingly, people who joined us on the webinar today said the most important thing to them is their ability to protect their clients' data. So we probably have a bunch of IT providers on the line with us today watching the webinar. Knowing that they're here interested in how to protect their clients' data, what are some of the practical things that businesses do, that our attendees today can do to help prevent these types of attacks from happening?
So I think there's always a huge amount of information that's ultimately available, and some of that is, some information overlaps, and then everybody tries to find the simplest solution or the easy button that's going to solve all of their problems. So I always advise people to take a step back, take a step back and go back to effectively what the basics are. When you look at, the end to end, how do these types of attacks occur? Do you have coverage for the basic areas? Do you have user coverage? Do you have system coverage? Do you have network coverage? Do you have the capability of at least creating roadblocks where the types, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that adversaries can use are either visible or effectively preventable? You don't necessarily need to jump in with both feet and implement a $60 million security solution, that covers endpoints and has monitoring and people that take care of things. I think there is a lot, there is a way to put roadblocks in place that is actually very cost effective for customers, but at the same time buys them time to be able to think through what the maturity of their security program ultimately looks like. So again, back to the basics, take a look at it. How is my data protected today? How are my systems protected today? How is my access control set up? Does everybody have access to everything with administrator rights? Like, there's some very, very simple and very cost-effective ways to begin to build out a program that helps get you to that next level of maturity.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jen. Sort of tactically speaking, we get the question often as well. One of the things that sometimes people overlook when it comes to what security controls do I need to put in place to defend myself against a security threat is something that's not really security related, which is a very obvious one, which is backups. And when you talk to most organizations and you ask them, do you have backup technologies in place, solutions, processes? The general answer is, oh yeah, absolutely. So my follow-up question is, when's the last time you actually tested it? When's the last time you took a backup and said, I'm going to redeploy this backup into production? And you get a whole bunch of, well, we haven't done that for a while. And the challenge is that even if you implement the right solution, the right process around backup, and if you're not testing it, you're not actually validating your ability to recover. So when you get hit with something like a ransomware attack and your drives or your servers or your databases get encrypted, and then you try to sort of unwind that by redeploying backups and they don't work, then you're sort of stuck. So I think one of the things that I always mention is, don't forget that backups are important, but it's not just the solution and the process and the team and the people, but making sure that you are routinely testing them. Super, super critical. And then the other obvious one I'd mention is awareness. Compromised vector email continues to be wildly popular because it's easy. It's easy for operators to send a bazillion emails and spoof legitimate domains and use sort of compromised infrastructure to send malicious emails to people. So that user awareness front end is super important. But to Jen's point, there's a lot of different technologies you can buy and a lot of different approaches, but it starts with taking a step back and looking at your organization holistically, understanding your threat model, which is also a thing that I see very infrequently done. But then looking at things really strategically from that point of view and saying, what's at risk? What would they want to do? Who are those adversaries? And implement the controls that you believe will help you defend against them. And everyone's sort of network and infrastructure and design is different. One other thing I'll mention too is we did a survey recently. I think it was several thousand C-level and director level technology executives, which includes security people. And the question was, what percent of total company budget is spent on cybersecurity? And it was interesting to see that over 25% of the respondents said between 1% and 4% of the entire company's budget. 6% responded with what security budget. So imagine if you're part of that 6% of the several thousand people that responded to that question. It's tough because we don't always have the budgets that we need, whether we're part of the security team or we're part of the technology team. So we have to be innovative in our approaches.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's two things that I kind of want to tack on to what you just said, and one of them is sort of an anecdotal story around the criticality of backups, or having disaster recovery plans that have effectively been tested, right? I think after the threats of physical attacks and terrorism attacks in the United States of America, we put together a lot of emphasis went into the physical security and disaster recovery process, but then that sort of died down. And as we start to see these ransomware attacks continue to increase, the effectiveness of those DR plans hasn't been tested in quite some time. But I always think back to one of my favorite stories or experiences that I've had, sort of in my past life, was working with a customer who, unfortunately came a little bit too late in the day. They'd already been ransomed. But just talking to the CISO of that company, and he highlighted that, it wasn't anywhere near as bad for them as what they've seen for other companies, because they actually took snapshots every single day of their critical infrastructure. And so getting the boxes back up and running was within 24 hours of the event occurring. It did take them a full 7 days to recover completely, and making sure they got the data imported back into the databases and things like that. But because they had those snapshots, it was like instant, being back up. So their customers didn't experience a tremendous amount of outage in the context of impact. Now, they couldn't go back and look at past invoices and things like that for a few days, but they were still able to process. They were still able to go. And then, sort of the second thing that you had, that you're highlighting, one thing I think, that's happened, at least in the security industry, and one of the reasons why, I love what we do here, specifically at DNSFilter, is really the affordability of security solutions. I think there's been a shift in terms of really, really good and really effective tools now moving out of an affordable range for many of the very impacted and very high risk type of customers. You think about supply chain attacks, for example. A supply chain in itself, you think about a manufacturing company, they're not necessarily sourcing every single part or making every single part themselves in-house in their own environment. They may have a good security team and a good security program, but they have suppliers that feed into them. A mom and pop shop that's manufacturing a specific microchip, and is contracted to that larger company for 50 years. They have one computer, and it's the invoice computer that connects to that parent company, but they read emails on that computer. So I think we've kind of also lost a little bit, in terms of our ability to look at that protection from end to end, and lost, that middle layer of protection, affordable security. Not everybody can afford $26 an endpoint. Like, you just can't. And you're not, to your point, 6%, what security budget? So I think it's a combination of a number of things that people can do that are relatively affordable, looking at solutions like what we offer here. There's other, types of solutions from, user training. There's, endpoint protection. There's a lot that are actually relatively affordable that can help you put together a good, decent security program that allows you to get time to get, more money, or at least start to begin education across your business.
Yeah, you nailed it, Jen. I think the last stat I read about small businesses in America, they comprise 97% of all businesses, and there are over 30 million small businesses. And I think the SBA categorized as 500 or less employees. So it's a lot. That middle part, especially here in the United States, is such a big and susceptible area where the affordability of security solutions has not been there. $26 an endpoint. There's no way they're going to be able to pay that, right? They're trying to figure out how to grow their business, their small business. So completely agreed. And I think that's where the value that a lot of the providers that we work with and some of the providers on the call today that bring to our customers.
So if I could just ask a follow-up on that, was this section kind of started about some practical things business can do to prevent. Both you and Jen touched on preparation, recovery a little bit, referring back to your study on spending on cybersecurity being at an all-time high. Is that just on prevention, or are they planning for the recovery? Are they planning for the PR, the lost business? Like what's the rest of that budget look like? Do you have any insight into that?
Good question. I think very few people, except for the big companies that have been through a really, really bad situation or incident, or one of their peers has been through a bad incident, are the very few that even think about PR. When I spent several years at Mandiant, and one of the things that we would tell boards in preparation for an incident, if it was sort of a preemptive dialogue or during an incident, was get your PR teams mobilized, get your comms teams mobilized. And back in 2004 and 5, when we were having these conversations, what felt like for the first time, because it was the emergence of the advanced persistent threat actor, at least as we know it, they were like, why would I mobilize my comms team? And we're like, this is a PR incident. This is going to get out and you need to be ahead of it. So to come back to your question, I think a lot of people still spend their budgets are on sort of defensive solutions and technologies and services. I think there is a very small portion that's spent on things around PR and comms. And if it is spent, it's generally part of the marketing budget, so you won't see it on the security side of the house. But I'm interested in Jen's thoughts as well.
No, I think that's good. If you think about, the way that I kind of categorize that in my head is, what is your incident response plan? And how much, in the context of budget, how much of your budget actually covers incident response capabilities? Whether it is PR, whether it is, brand impact, whether, it's being able to do the recovery piece of it, whether it's emergency needing to purchase new systems to spin something up pretty quickly, to be able to get your business back online. So yeah, I would agree. I think, I think of it as an incident response plan. How do you handle an incident? How do you, who's involved? Is it just an outage? Is it something that stays contained in IT, or is this something that that impacts your entire business? So yeah, good point.
Yeah, thanks for that follow-up, addressing that for me. So let's start with Weiss on this one, because Ubiq Security is largely focused on encryption. Encryption these days is effectively standard in most environments. I don't know if you'd say most companies, but a lot of companies encrypt their user devices and servers, and it's more and more common on operating systems that encryption is built in. Is this effective? Is it a step? Like, does this give us any protection from extortion and this ransomware?
It's a great question that we get very, very often. I'm going to separate out sort of network encryption, things like TLS or using IPsec VPNs, and focus more on the at-rest or storage encryption, which is predominantly, what's relevant as it relates to this question, because that's where our data resides, right? It resides in an S3 bucket or an Azure blob or on a file server somewhere. And the reality is, most of the storage encryption solutions that we're using today were developed 20 years ago. And they were developed for a physical theft use case. Someone walks in and steals someone's laptop, or someone goes into someone's office and literally pulls a server from a rack. That's not really the threat that we're dealing with today, whether it's ransomware or advanced persistent threat actor, because now we're dealing with network-based attacks. And the issue with the majority of the existing at-rest encryption solutions is that they're built upon what's referred to as a central implicit trust model, which basically means that if you're running database encryption on a database, that database is built on a central trust model, which then grants the database administrator the ability to turn off encryption. In many cases, it also grants the sysadmin of that same server or instance to be able to turn it off, or the hypervisor. So what this essentially means is that you think you have encryption that's effective, and if you're compromised via network attack, the intruder gets in your environment, will go through the process of credential harvesting and say, hey, who has database admin credentials? Who's got AD credentials? Who's got S3 credentials or AWS credentials? And they'll credential harvest. And once they get possession of those admin credentials, they simply turn off the encryption. They will prepare and package your data. encrypt it themselves if it's part of a ransomware attack. And if it's part of a multifaceted ransomware attack or double extortion, the core topic of today's conversation, they'll then exfiltrate that data offsite and then turn around and ransom you and say, pay me or I'll publish it online or I'll sell it to the highest bidder. So to come back to the question, the reason most traditional encryption solutions don't work is because of this flawed central implicit trust model.
100% agreed. Privilege escalation, if you look at it, is one of the predominant, tactics and techniques used actually across both, if you talk about overlapping techniques, both across, e-crime or ransomware and across advanced persistent threat actors as well. I'm just laughing because I think about, when I think about that, the minute you have admin, it's all over. Or I should say the minute they have admin, it's all over, right? It's all over. That's all you need. I've seen so many, so many interesting things happen, based off of credential theft and the use of administrative privileges. I've seen crazy stuff where these, where ransomware actors have legitimately spun up fake Active Directory environments in people's own cloud infrastructure, for the sole purpose of actually deploying, that it hosted the ransomware, and then they deployed scheduled tasks to every single AD user that went to that, legitimate server hosted in that company's own environment to download and use that ransomware. So all because they're, it started with the fact that these actors had legitimate administrative privileges.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's sort of lost upon us in the security community is that when we think about a firewall, we lock down who's got access to administer that firewall, adjust rules, changes, whatever they may be. And it's generally a security operator or someone on the network security team or the network team, but it's a small group of people. And when we think about endpoint protection solutions, sort of same premise. And they're sort of security tools run by the security team or folks within the IT organization with sort of a security background and security experience. But with encryption, they're infrastructure tools that happen to fall under the banner of security. And we're relying on the infrastructure environments in the infrastructure organization to manage those tools, yet the same credentials that run that security component or that security feature also run the core database functionality or the storage functionality. So it's not just a ransomware attacker that you got to be worried about. It's insider threats, whether it's a deliberate insider threat or, hey, something happened by accident, because those people just natively, through their job function, have access to be able to turn encryption on.
Yeah, it's easy to imagine a scenario where somebody's trying to test something or deploy a new service and feel just like, oh, the encryption's getting in the way. Let me just turn it off and forget to turn it back on. In terms of managing credentials and access, is that something that is better handled by larger companies because they have better process maturity and can lock that down a little bit more? Or is it just kind of all over the place?
It's all over the place.
I guess the number of stories we see on ransomware attacks that start with a password that's admin123 is probably enough insight into that question to answer it.
I think it doesn't matter the company size, to be bluntly honest with you. I think it doesn't make any difference on whether or not you have paid $100 million to put the proper security tooling in place, or if you've paid $100 to put some security tools in place. When it comes down to administrative privileges, it makes no difference once they get their hands on that. Yep.
All right. Well, Weiss, you mentioned exfiltration, but whoever wants to answer this, feel free to jump in. To focus a little bit more on the double ransomware part, that threat that we've exfiltrated your data, and if you don't pay again, we're going to release it. How do you know they're going to hold up their word? I think, to some extent, we expect that they'll turn over the encryption key, because if they don't, people will stop paying. Do we have that same expectation about publishing data that have been taken out of the network?
I would assume in most cases.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Jen. No, go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a hard one to answer. I think the reality is it depends. It depends on who the player is. I mean, I think the first thing that I always recommend, for people, if they're beginning to have those types of conversations, or are ransomed and need to consider what the next step is to engage professional folks who do ransomware negotiation. They can help you before you even talk to before you even talk to the other party. They can help you understand who you are playing with and what the risk is of, if you pay, are they going to delete? I think we've heard of a couple instances where they haven't, or maybe there was a negotiation that just kind of went wrong and the customer might have paid, what the agreed amount was with the negotiator, and then the adversary came back and demanded more. But again, remember, this is also a business, and to some extent they have a reputation to uphold too. And if you say you're going to delete the customer, you're going to delete the victim's data after getting paid, and then you don't do it, I mean, it's the same thing as not keeping a promise to your customer. So don't overlook that, is it 100%? Are you always going to get the honorable criminal, I guess? No, but I would strongly urge that you work with a professional ransomware negotiator before having those conversations.
Jen, I think your last point nailed it around getting a professional to negotiate, because it's like FBI hostage negotiators. That's what they do. You don't want to be negotiating someone else's life if it's not something that you do for a living, and it's not something you have a lot of experience with. And then your earlier point was also, I think, absolutely spot on, that this is a business. It's in their best interest to do what they say, because they know that that reputation will carry through. And the next time a ransom negotiator is talking to this specific ransomware group, there's a high likelihood that they're confident that they will pay. So they may suggest to a customer that you should actually pay the ransom in the situation.
Yeah, exactly.
And similarly, probably planning for the scenario in which case your data does get released, either because you choose not to pay the ransom, or maybe not even given the opportunity, working with somebody to make sure that's worked into your disaster recovery plan, disaster response plan. So if we look to the future, what's the next evolution? I think for a long time we were just dealing with the encryption, and people kind of got used to that. Then these businesses evolved and they figured out they could make more money on the back end with the exfiltration of the data. Where do you see this going? Is there a triple extortion threat on the horizon?
Do you want the scary story or the politically correct story?
Well, do you have something happy and cheerful for us? I mean, we have some time to recover. It's not the end of the webinar, but give people nightmares here.
I could. But I think that's a really good question, and it's a little bit hard. It's a little bit hard to tell. Is that a probability where, are we going to see an evolution of, as people put stronger protections in place, the less likelihood of them paying as they begin to rebuild out their disaster recovery plans, as they can recover faster, where these ransomware incidents aren't anywhere near as impactful? Is this going to evolve? Well, yeah. I mean, your customer base is changing. Your total addressable market is changing, to use business terms. So absolutely, it will evolve. Could it evolve into a triple extortion? I've stolen your data, I've encrypted your stuff, and now I'm going to threaten to bring down your network. It could. I don't feel like that one is really likely, though. I feel like what's going to happen is we're actually going to see a shift in where they start to target. It won't be, I'm going to DDoS your stuff. It will be, I'm going to take down your ability to save your patients. It will be, I'm going to take down your ability to provide electricity to 100,000 people. It will be, I think what's going to evolve is the threat itself in what they ultimately will do.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah,
Wes?
I totally agree. No, I totally agree. I mean, you're hearing some security experts talk about it now. They're referring to it as multifaceted extortion. There has been some early evidence that by people, I'm referring to the threat actors, are sort of threatening a DDoS attack. But I think Jen's spot on, and I think it's going to depend on the target victim and what sort of core of their business. Again, their whole MO is to extract money out of you, because that's how they feed themselves and their families and whomever else that's getting a cut of this. So it's going to depend on your target victim organization, and I think you'll probably see patterns within specific industries, because they just share commonalities in the business and the business operations. But I think they will 1000% high confident that they will evolve, because we've watched them for the last 15 to 20 years, from your traditional, very basic attacks to your advanced persistent threat actors to the ransomware operators. They evolve. They have to evolve to stay relevant and to make money.
So we're going to start to transition into some questions that had come in from the attendees as they registered for the webinar today. Let us first, though, slip in one more poll, and we'll look at which of these protections do you already have in place. Do you have application layer encryption? Do you have DNS security? Or do you not have either of these in place? And while people are voting on that, we'll just take an opportunity to hear about how the respective companies address that. So let's start with Wise. How does Ubiq Security help combat extortion and ransomware for mid-sized companies?
Yeah, our focus is predominantly on how do we prevent the second extortion, the double extortion, where your data is exfiltrated in a decrypted state. Coming back to some comments I made earlier around some of the flaws or the Achilles heels of the existing at rest storage encryption solutions, is this whole idea of the implicit central trust model, which is that the database admin, the cloud admin, the storage admin all have the ability to turn off encryption or to view that data in a decrypted state, which is a risk, not only from an insider threat point of view, but from an outside threat actor perspective as well. So the basic premise around our solution is enabling customers to integrate encryption natively into the applications that they run and operate within their companies, which basically means that encryption and decryption operations happen within the applications themselves. So before they're ever handed to the wire, whether they're going outside the network or inside the network, they're leaving the application in encrypted state. And once they reach the storage layer, that information, that data is encrypted. So even if the database server is compromised, or your cloud infrastructure is compromised, or your file servers, the adversaries will not be able to simply turn the encryption off and extract the data out.
And Jen, same question to you. How does DNSFilter help combat extortion, ransomware for mid-sized companies?
So I would say, in a nice combination with what Ubiq Security does, we actually cover the first part. So how do we protect our users? How do we help protect, how DNSFilter, helps protect users and systems from that initial encryption in the first place? So you think about the user aspect, being able to help filter out and prevent, people from accessing malicious sites that may have payload that ultimately, get downloaded and then begin the, encryption train. Or even from a system perspective, are your systems accessing, are your systems accessing the internet in places that it ultimately shouldn't be? So when you think about DNS, everything uses it. We all use it. It's the one big thing that, I think many people take for granted, yet at the same time is extremely overlooked as we begin to focus far more on how do I protect that endpoint or how do I protect that network? In the meantime, these actors are getting through very easily through, phishing campaigns, through, being able to, getting access to systems and being able to go out anywhere on the internet from an important server to ultimately download their payload. So this is the area that we focus on the DNSFilter side. So when you think about the combination of, a very good, very easy to implement, DNS filtering solution plus, a very good and very easy to implement encryption solution, what you've done is put in a very effective layer to buy yourself more time.
And with that, let's take a look at our last poll. Which of these protections do you have in place already? It looks like 52% already have application layer encryption in place. 88% already have DNS security in place. Excellent, well done. And 4% have neither in place. Now, this is not the end of the webinar, but I will take a moment to let everybody know if you don't have one of these in place, head to either DNSFilter.com to get that DNS security started, or over to ubiqsecurity.com to get a trial with the application layer encryption and help keep your networks safe from these kinds of attacks. And with that, let's jump into some of the questions that were submitted by our attendees before the webinar started. Why are businesses not investing in simple countermeasures against ransomware, such as offline backups? Who wants to jump in on that one? I know Wise talked about the costs earlier.
Yeah, I touched upon this a little bit in response to a previous question. I think the short answer is I think most people are. They're just not testing and validating to make sure that they can redeploy and recover from those situations. It's not that I think a lot of organizations aren't doing it. They are. They're just not going through the process of making sure that they have run through that and they can actually recover.
Dusting off that tape, putting it back in.
It's all in the recovery. Anything to add to that, Jen?
No, I think I am not able to articulate anymore. Weiss did good.
So long. I always have to have my tea ready so I don't.
Yeah, I've got my Diet Dr. Pepper. I think it's time for some caffeine.
Are there any early signs, like we sometimes see with viruses, that a potential infection or infiltration has happened prior to the encryption and exfiltration of the data?
That's a good question. There are many signs. The problem is that they're very, very hard to look for. This isn't simple like it used to be. It's not necessarily just, it's not about somebody dropping an executable on a system and executing it anymore. As Weiss said multiple times, there is distinct overlap between the tactics, techniques, and procedures that nation state actors do and that ransomware actors do. And a lot of that is really about how they get in. I kind of gave that anecdotal story, privilege escalation, administrative level access, going to the depths, going to the lengths of spinning up, fake servers that host their actual payload, deploying, via group policies and Active Directory, a scheduled task that tells every host machine to go and download that payload, all within the customer's environment. So it is not so easy or, not so cut and dry anymore as this file should not be on this system. It is very much needing to have a deeper level of visibility and knowledge of your environment around what's going on, what systems are talking to what accounts have what privileges, what are those accounts doing. I think Weiss also said something that I really liked as well, which is it's not just a security problem anymore. This becomes a full infrastructure, full IT problem. It's a combination of all of those aspects that make up the service, the tool, the whatever it is that your business provides, and making sure that each group that works on that understands their role in noticing anomalies to behaviors.
All right.
I nailed it. Nothing on my side.
Nothing to add, Weiss?
No.
All right. What, in addition to endpoint protection, strict firewall rules, IPS and DNS protection, are some best practices for fending off ransomware attacks? And I will let
and
either
user
of you
awareness. Yeah, I was just rereading the question. I think that those are some good things that you can certainly provide, but I'll again go back to the basics. Go and read any major report on a ransomware attack. Go read several reports on the colonial ransomware attack, and take a look at how those investigations. What did they uncover about how this happened? Privilege escalation, business email compromise, and user awareness. People still click phishing every single day. I could show you stats and stats and stats and stats of phishing email access. Why is this still a thing? And I think, there is an aspect of human behavior that, we can't cover from a security perspective, or that we can't protect against, but have we gotten lax in the security in helping our users still be aware of their role in the security train. So I think there's a lot of different things that can be done, a lot of low-hanging fruit that can ultimately be pulled to put different types of mechanisms in place.
And Weiss, based on the study you referenced earlier, maybe we'll start with you on this one. Anything that nonprofits can do to minimize risk while trying to protect themselves on a budget?
Fantastic question. My general advice here is, if you're very budget constrained, don't try to do it yourself, because engaging with multiple cybersecurity experts to come in, help you build a policy, a strategy, potentially an operation, and then go and talk to multiple different vendors. If you've just looked at the endpoint sort of landscape in security, it'll make your brain explode, because there's so many people. And I'm in security, and I've been in security my entire career, basically. So if you're one of those organizations trying to tackle that problem, and endpoint just one sort of slice of it, And if you're trying to tackle that problem on your own, you're going to get frustrated very quickly, be way out of your depth, and then very, very quickly realize you don't have the money. So to come back to your question, I think it's for those organizations that are budget constrained, is working with the right partners, the right managed security service providers, the right managed service providers to help them get that solution and that practice and that operation in place, because they figured out the scale. They've worked with multiple vendors. They know the vendors that will help those specific organizations achieve their security objectives. So my recommendation is always, if you're very budget constrained, find a great partner, specifically a managed security service partner to work with, because they're going to help you in ways way beyond just budget.
Anything you want to add to that one, Jen?
No, 100% agreed.
Then
Well
we
said.
will forge ahead. What is being done by authorities to enforce breach reporting, and why is this still a challenge?
It's a good and a very, very, we don't quite have enough time to go across the whole gamut of the question, but I think the easiest way to simplify this is very similar to what we're currently experiencing in the pandemic today. It's a lot harder than you think to implement a standard that is an enforceable standard, because there's no point in having standards if you have no ability to enforce them, you know, one way or the other. In breach, you know, the standards that do exist for when you have a breach were ultimately designed 10, 15 years ago and haven't been updated since today. But there have also been a lot of, I'm trying to think of how to say it, like there's been a lot of lobbyists that are against this, right? Especially from a private sector perspective is what it boils down to. They don't want to tell the public when something happens. It costs them a lot of money to tell the public, you know, something that, you know, we as consumers in many cases have an absolute right to know. So when you do look at those types of breach reporting guidelines, they're very explicit and contain a number of loopholes as to minimize the impact to those particular companies. And the downside of that, though, it's always a double-edged sword. So I'll use that nonprofit example. You know, if you know, the same standards kind of apply to a nonprofit organization, and that could be a death knell for a small company. So it needs to change. It needs to be reviewed, and it definitely needs to be updated to today, and not the, you know, physical breaches or, you know, the Sarbanes-Oxley type breaches of many, many years ago. But it's not just that simple to do.
Yeah, the enforcement incentives are one thing, but then there are the social incentives, the business incentives, all at odds with each other. All right, we're doing good on questions. This next question is one that actually came in from a attendee here live on the webinar. Is there any way to get small businesses on board with an investment in security other than shocking them with worst case scenarios?
Is there, ask the question one more time.
What's a better motivator than fear to get small businesses on board with investing in security? Is that the only way, is to share these worst case scenarios and try and scare them into it?
I think it's a really good question. I'm going to have to let Weiss answer, because I am trying to think of a good way off the top of my head, but I've been talking about scary things for the past 45 minutes. So
no, it's a very, very good question. One of the things that I've seen used to help motivate small businesses is making it clear to them that the reason their customers go to them is because they trust them. Whether it's a food service or a professional service, their customers trust that organization to deliver on their expectations. And I think if you take the angle of security can help you increase that customer trust and being transparent about that security, I think that can actually help a small business grow its market share or increase its customer base by the sheer fact of driving more trust.
And possibly partly convincing them or making the argument that it's cheaper to prevent one of these problems than to have to deal with it. But it's, you know, security is never convenient, right? I mean, I guess except in the case of DNSFilter, where it's a level of security that actually makes the network faster. But it's a tough challenge getting people to invest in prevention is always harder. I mean, do we all go to the doctor preventatively like we should be? I don't know. All right. Well, thanks so much to both of you for joining. I think that's the last of the questions we had today. Let's wrap it up with some final thoughts. Either of you want to share anything to wrap up the conversation here?
I just want to
Yeah,
say
I'd
thank
say,
you for, sorry, Wise.
go ahead, Jen. Go ahead, Jen.
I just want to say thank you for everybody attending today. And, if anybody has any questions, by all means, reach out to the information that I'm sure Mike has provided. And Weiss, it's always good fun to talk to you.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you to all for your time. Hopefully this was informative. I'll also throw out if you guys have any questions regarding anything we talked about, whether it's, why do we think policy is not moving fast enough for sort of breach disclosures, or, hey, Weiss, what are you guys doing? Like, what are the security tools that you're using, and who are the providers you're working with? I'm happy to talk offline in private with individuals, because just like all of your organizations, we face the same type of problems. We are not immune to them. And we've had hard lessons because, between Jen and I, we've probably seen hundreds, if not thousands of breaches and compromises and all kinds of nasty things that'll just be more scary things to talk about. So we won't get into it, but happy to address questions in that domain as well. But thanks again for everyone to your time.
And we do have easy ways for people to get started if they do want to check out either DNSFilter or Ubiq security. We have the links here on the page. If you head to either of these pages, the directions to get started with that are very straightforward. I guess that's where we're going to wrap up. Thanks to everybody for joining. Head out and if you're not already set up with this protection, hopefully some of you fall in a category of using both application layer encryption and DNS filtering already. But for those of you who don't, check out the sites and get yourself set up. And thanks to Weiss and Jen for joining me today. Thanks to everybody on the DNSFilter team for helping get this organized and set up. And thank you to you all for attending today. And hope you enjoy the rest of your day. We will do this again soon. Thanks, everyone.